6:30 over here on the George Washington side of the Grandview Terrace.
Walk over.
You feel better? I'm sorry.
It's starting.
Not too hot today, so we're all staying cool. Awesome. Well, like I said, welcome to Mount Rushmore, everyone. My name is Ranger Maggie, and as you may have heard, I'm going to talk a little bit about the indigenous history of this area, and also each of these presidents on Mount Rushmore's relationships with indigenous people, because each of them had different interactions and policies that kind of influenced how they viewed those people. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's such an interesting thing to talk about here at Mount Rushmore. But first, if you do need a restroom at any time during the talk, the closest ones are going to be downstairs in the visitor center. There are elevators and stairs on either side that'll take you down a level and just head right into that building. On a sort of related note, if we get far into the talk and you decide you're not interested, you have something else you'd rather do, won't hurt my feelings if you walk off. Feel free to do that. I know everyone's got a busy day and this is your trip, so do what you feel like you need to do. But like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about indigenous history here, and that is a very complicated and sometimes upsetting history. So again, if anything in this talk does upset you, I'm not going to say good, but at least it's getting you thinking. If it is upsetting to the point that you feel like you need to leave, again, that will not hurt my feelings. Feel free to head out. But before we get started, I 20 indigenous tribes, and they have been for thousands of years. So that's what makes this such an interesting place to talk about indigenous history, because it has a very rich indigenous history and it has a very complicated history. So I'll go into that a little bit more later, but you can kind of be thinking about that special place to you. How would you feel if that got taken away from you, or you could never go back to that place? Some complicated feelings that might kind of bring up in you. Again, you don't have to share that with me. I know that's very personal, but it puts you in kind of the right headspace. So before we get into talking about the Black Hills as a whole, I do want to talk about the presidents that we see behind me on the mountain here, because as I said before, each of these men had kind of interesting and complicated relationships with the indigenous people and a lot of the legislation regarding indigenous people. So it's a pretty important thing to talk about. Plus, you all came here to see these presidents, so I want to talk about them a little bit. George Washington is who I'll start off with first, not only because he's the first president on the mountain, but also because he was the first president of the United States. So he comes first chronologically. George Washington was chosen for Mount Rushmore because he represents kind of the birth of the country, the beginning of the country, and our independence from Great Britain. But because he was one of those early Americans in this country, he also came into contact with a lot of the earliest inhabitants of this country, a lot of indigenous people. I don't have a whole lot to talk about with George Washington since it was so early. There are some more kind of complex interactions later on we go, but George Washington did fight alongside various indigenous groups during the French and Indian War. Including at different times Iroquois people, Cherokee people, and those would have been people that were on the side of the British in that conflict. So they worked alongside the British against the French and their Native American allies, and when it came time for the colonies to fight for independence from Great Britain, a lot of those people actually were on their side as well. So I think that's a really interesting thing to note, because these are the original inhabitants of that area, and they are siding with basically a country that is going to have that more complicated history with them going forward. A lot of kind of displacement going on there, but they did side with the colonists and kind of help that country come into being. Not very good. But kind of gives you an idea of the techniques that were going on, how they were kind of fighting side by side. It was a partnership, but I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson is kind of one of our first presidents that had like really extended interactions with indigenous people. So Thomas Jefferson is included on Mount Rushmore because he represents kind of the expansion of the country, especially with the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase more than doubled the size of the United States. Along with that, it also more than doubled the number of indigenous groups that people from the East were coming into contact with as they were moving west. So before I get to the Louisiana Purchase, though, Thomas Jefferson did something very, very important before that. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is kind of the founding document for America. It's the first big document that we as Americans use to kind of found our country. We're coming up on the anniversary of that here pretty quick. And as the author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson actually did include a passage about Indigenous people in that document, and I will read to you what he says. So in the Declaration of Independence, he calls Native American people the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Lincoln has a really, really interesting story. So Abraham Lincoln is next chronologically. He's not next on the mountain, but he's next chronologically, so I want to talk about him next. He was included on Mount Rushmore kind of because of his preservation of the country, especially with the Civil War, keeping the Union together as one country. Yeah. So a lot of people kind of see him as sort of a civil rights president because he was able to end slavery and keep the country together. However, a lot of people don't know that he actually presided over the largest mass execution in United States history, which I will get to, but I want to give you a little bit of background first. So Abraham Lincoln grew up with his father and his father's brother Mordecai had kind of an interesting, really kind of a traumatic event that had happened to them when they were children. So Abraham Lincoln's grandfather, who was also named Abraham Lincoln, he had actually been killed by a Native American man who came onto his land, killed him in front of his children. Mordecai Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's uncle, retaliated, killed that man. He also later killed just like a random Native American man who wandered into town, kind of as retaliation he saw for it, but this was something he bragged about. He talked about it a lot, and Mordecai Lincoln was Abraham Lincoln's hero when he was growing up. He thought he was just the smartest guy ever. He was a really personable guy, really funny guy. So this was kind of the environment that Lincoln was growing up in. Obviously, a very traumatic event for Lincoln's father and Lincoln's uncle. No real sugarcoating that, right? And it kind of almost makes sense, this kind of hatred that they would have had for those people, because these are the people who took their father away. And it would have made sense for that kind of viewpoint to be passed on to young Abraham Lincoln. A lot of really kind of interesting things happened in the country as far as Indigenous relations went, as far as national parks went. So Theodore Roosevelt, a lot of people think he's included on Mount Rushmore because of his work with the national parks. No, he's included on Mount Rushmore because he kind of represents the expansion of the country as well, sort of its rise to a modern world power, especially with his involvement in the Panama Canal. But like I said, a lot of people see him as kind of like the conservation president or the national parks president. He actually was not president when the first national park was made. That was in the 1870s. He also was not president when the National Park Service was made. But he gets kind of associated with the national parks because he was president during one very important act that passed through Congress, and that was the Antiquities Act of 1906. So the Antiquities Act gave the president basically complete power to create national monuments however he wanted and whenever he wanted. So Theodore Roosevelt kind of used and abused that. He, as a young man, had lost his wife and his mother on the exact same day. He, after that event, went off into the West, into the Badlands of North Dakota, and kind of built himself up mentally and physically. So he really valued kind of the restorative power of nature. He knew those were places that he wanted to protect and that he thought should be protected for future generations as well. So when the Antiquities Act was enabled, he kind of knew that that was his chance to do what he wanted to do. During his presidency, Theodore Roosevelt created 18 national monuments. 12 of those were to protect natural areas, including the Grand Canyon, which was a national monument before it was a national park. About six of those were created to protect cultural or historical areas. So those were El Morro National Monument in New Mexico, Montezuma's Castle National Monument in Arizona, Chaco Culture National Historical Park, which is in New Mexico as well, Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument in New Mexico, Tonto National Monument in Arizona, and Tumacacori National Monument, which is in southern Arizona. He was also the national president when Mesa Verde National Park became a national park. And Mesa Verde was actually the first ever national park that was created to protect culture and history rather than a natural area. What his view was on the indigenous people that he came into contact with, and that is this. He said, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the 10th. So it's not like he was this big champion of indigenous rights, right? He could recognize the value of the things that those people had built. However, he didn't necessarily respect them as people all of the time. While there was an active war being fought between the United States government and the Nez Perce people, the Nez Perce left their reservation, came through Yellowstone, and it ended up killing some of the tourists that were in the park. So there's always been this kind of overlap between the really difficult and sometimes hostile history between the United States government and Native American people and the National Park Service. That's a big part of our legacy as an agency. Sacred site to over 20 indigenous tribes. Here's a picture of Mt.Rushmore before any carving was done on the mountain. Before any carving was done, a lot of indigenous people in this area knew this place as Cougar Mountain because there are a lot of mountain lions in this area. In the 1950s, it became kind of renowned as the Six Grandfathers because of a vision that a Lakota holy man named Black Elk had to name this place that, and the Six Grandfathers represent the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west, Mother Earth and Father Sky. So this is a very special place. People have been here for thousands of years. I think even people who come into this region today can kind of feel that it's special even if they don't know the whole history. They can feel that it's a special place, even a sacred place, and kind of respond accordingly, I guess. So the Black Hills specifically were promised to the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people with the signing of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. So legally, this region belongs to them. That treaty was never nullified, so it is legally binding. Obviously, those people do not have control of this area right now. So, what 1,000?
And they live in very poor areas.
They can live anywhere, right? Thank you for sitting through my talk. I hope you learned something and that you also enjoyed it maybe a little bit. If not, also enjoy the rest of your